Welcome. My name's David Hayward. I'm the assistant editor of the BBC College of Journalism, which is an internal college at the BBC aimed at helping to improve journalism. And one of the issues that we are continually discussing and debating is the reporting of science and the difficulties of reporting science. Now, as Julie explained earlier on, I'm about the 15th choice of chair for this evening, which explains the enormous amount of printouts that I printed out at 5:30 this evening when we finally recognised that I was the person that was going to be chairing. So apologies if I don't have the exact details and as great a knowledge as our panel. I'm going to introduce our panel and then ask them a question, number of questions, and then we'll go to the audience, because I mean, having had a brief 15-minute discussion downstairs, I suspect we could probably talk about minute parts of the arguments and discussions that we're going to have for hours and hours and hours. So we're going to move it along and hopefully have a very good debate and discussion. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Mike Hulme from the University of East Anglia, Dr. Beth Taylor, who is the Director of Communications and External Relations for the Institute of Physics, and Michael Hanlon, the science editor for the Daily Mail. Now, I think the first question to ask, and I think I'll ask it to Mike, is can journalism report science effectively?
Well, the short answer is yes, they can. And I think there's some very good examples, certainly from my own field of climate change, of really good science reporting. We've seen that now, over 20 years of climate change being a public policy issue, a public issue. And I think there are some very good examples of getting science into, I'm thinking particularly of print media, I guess, which is perhaps the community of journalists that I've interacted mostly with. There are some problems or difficulties or peculiarities, though, about climate change as a science stroke policy stroke public issue that do make it difficult at times for some journalists or for some styles of journalistic reporting, I think, to cover what I would see as a practicing scientist or researcher, the nuances and the subtleties of climate change, and in particular, understanding where the boundaries, where the territories lie in climate change. What is actually science, if you like, scientific evidence and scientific analysis, following the classic tenets of good scientific practice. What is, secondly, what I would call the evaluation of risk, because climate change is innately uncertain, and how you evaluate, perceive the risks associated with climate change takes you beyond science, because you bring a whole load of value and ethical judgments to play. And the third level is actually then the policy response, if you like, the risk management. And there, we're way beyond science. We're into the messy, murky world of politics. And sometimes, you know, the boundaries between these different parts of the entire issue get blurred. They get sometimes deliberately blurred because people want to import political ideology into science. Equally, it goes the other way. Some scientists actually want to extend their remit beyond the classic tenets of what is good scientific practice and actually conduct political arguments using science as a proxy. So actually this blurring of these boundaries can work both ways. So where there are bad examples, I would not want to simply blame journalists alone. I think there is some culpability. Not myself, of course, but some of my scientific colleagues.
Beth.
I think the question was, can journalism report science properly? Yeah. And I think the answer is yes, actually. I will have a but as well later on. Yeah. But sort of looking at it broadly, I think it's really impressive how much science there is in the media, just on a daily basis. And I'm sort of thinking about this morning, switching on the radio and starting with, we were just talking a minute ago about the situation in Haiti, and there was someone from the Geological Survey talking about the science behind earthquake prediction. And I thought it was a really good and interesting issue and a good treatment of it. In the same programme, there was someone on talking about the David Nutt controversy, because there's a new chair, I think, today of the Drug Advisory Committee. So you could say, oh, is this good reporting of science? And maybe what they were talking about was more the political issues and the fact there was a controversy. At one level, as someone whose job is trying to get people interested in science, I don't mind that, because I think it's a good thing that it's out there. And if there hadn't been some controversy, then maybe nobody would have been discussing it. So I don't mind that, but there's a balance. And in the end, I think probably what we'll end up talking about a lot tonight is how you strike different balances between getting everything perfectly correct and getting it interesting, between what's science and what's policy, in a way between what's science and what's life. Because if you look at a lot of issues which are all about technology and the applications of science, it's hard to say that half of the stories in the media are about science in one form or another. So sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I do think it's a pretty healthy situation. And in fact, there was a report published today by
I believe I have a copy of it
Fox.
here.
Ah, you would do it. It'll be in, it'll be in all that, which is part of the government Science and Society initiative. They had a working group looking at science in the media. And having read only the press release, I'm afraid, I think what they were saying was that reporting of science is pretty healthy. If there's a problem, it's the kind of pressure on current journalism more generally. And I'm not sure even Lord Mandelson can fix that. So I think it's a pretty good answer.
Michael, I suspect you're going to say yes.
Well, the thing I would say is I can't think of another specialism in journalism which would be holding a talk like this. I cannot imagine a bunch of political journalists sitting up in a panel and asking an audience whether political journalism was fair, whether it was rigorous, whether it was honest, because people just assume it isn't. And I think probably science journalism, when I would include medical, health, environmental journalism, has an almost sort of masochistic desire to self-flagellate and be very, very nervous about appearing to be sensationalist and almost being tainted with the same brush that affects the rest of journalism. And I think to that extent, most of the people I know who are science journalists are very, very keen to get it right. I think the quality of science reporting in this country is actually very good. And as well as not being able to imagine another specialism that could be having a talk like this, I can't actually imagine another country that would be having a talk like this. I attend a major science conference every year in the United States. It's the biggest one, general science conference in the world, the AAAS. And it's quite interesting that the number of British journalists at it actually outnumbers the number of American journalists at it, and it's their own conference. And we massively outnumber the journalists from all other European nations. And it's very hard to imagine, without sounding too jingoistic, that this happening in Germany or France, from what I've seen of coverage of science there. So I think it is quite healthy. I think there's quite a lot of debate among science journalists about how to cover things like climate change. And I think science journalists, we all have to realize that a lot of the things we deal with that are controversial aren't entirely scientific questions. And I would wrap climate change in among them, as we were talking earlier. I don't think our response to climate change isn't an entirely scientific issue. And I think we have to accept that, and that's where it gets murky and interesting.
I think the panel is very interesting, as we were discussing down, because we have a scientist who's also a communications director into PR, and a journalist. So we have the three sort of almost conflicting parts of the triangle here. I would say that it is quite interesting, isn't it? Where we talk about the science of and the science of when you believe scientists. I mean, there are a number of examples of science and the great body of scientific expertise and knowledge saying one thing, and in many ways the media is saying something else. I mean, MMR is a very good example of this, I think. Now, How dangerous is that? How much of a problem do you see that as a... Beth?
Well, I do think that's dangerous, but perhaps over-optimistically, I actually think that the MMR scare has probably been good for reporting because it's made people take a step back and think, how did that happen? And I mean, I'm sure you'll have a different, or a different perspective on this. But I think since then, people have taken a bit more care to think about what is the majority view, and is it one person with a very strong case and a whole 99.99% of the rest of the scientific community with a different case and evidence to support it. I'm not saying that people won't any longer find two dissenting voices and have a bit of a debate, but I do believe people are more careful now not to get carried away with one person with a very dramatic story. I don't know if you think that's over-optimistic.
I think it depends on the person. If they're good enough at selling themselves, we'll cover them. I mean, the MMR was in, as you say, it was a good thing in some ways in that it did blow the cover a little bit on this kind of maverick scientist narrative. It's pretty clear now that what Andrew Wakefield was saying was not correct, that he had an agenda that had very little to do with health and medicine. But I think saying that this means that we won't do the same thing in the future is maybe a little bit optimistic. I think the media loves a good story, and I think the idea of a maverick challenging the medical establishment is too good a story to miss. And I think if it happens again, it'll happen again.
I think, I mean, one similarity, if you like, between science and media reporting, as I would understand it, is actually scientists like to be contrary. I mean, science can only function by contrariness. And so, actually, there's a tremendous incentive within the norms and practices and rewards of scientists for scientists to come up with a theory or a piece of evidence that blows away some conventional idea in science. So if someone can come along, for example, with climate change and say that actually, you know, CO2 in the atmosphere does not absorb infrared radiation, you know, that person who made that discovery would win a Nobel Prize. So there's a great incentive within science to be contrary and to challenge and to criticize. Maybe in the same way that in journalism there is an incentive to find this maverick story because it will make the headlines. And it will make that journalist, if that story is well supported over a period of time, it will make that journalist successful. So actually, there are incentives in both of these practices, institutions, to challenge and to criticize. And it's a healthy thing. Certainly in science, it's a healthy thing to have that challenge and critical edge. And I think for me, one of the interesting, unanticipated side effects of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was set up 20 years ago, to actually bring considered science into the policy realm. One of the unanticipated and perhaps not so welcome side effects of the IPCC is that it has actually made it harder for scientists to retain that critical edge. Because the IPCC is seen as this all-embracing, monolithic consensus statement of what scientists know about climate change, it actually has established itself as an authority voice that in some sense transcends the normal, routine, day-to-day practices of science. So the IPCC has done a great job in many ways, but it also has had some perverse consequences for science, and I think maybe in some sense as journalists are not quite sure how to take the IPCC. Do you take the IPCC as absolutely gospel truth that cannot be challenged at all, or actually do you still see it that around the edges there are still some very lively and important debates to report to media audiences?
Michael, what do you?
I think if we were to, if climate change was to start happening tomorrow, we wouldn't do the IPCC. I think it's actually been a not very effective way of dealing with this problem. I think it was probably modelled on the whole Montreal protocol to deal with the CFCs and the ozone layer, which was very quick, very easy to decide what the physics was. An answer could be found very quickly, and it was done, and it worked. I think because climate change is so much messier and so much longer term, I think journalists are, everybody is much more sceptical about the IPCC. It's been rumbling along now, what was it, 1988? 22 years. And it's so big and so disparate, and we had this calamity of a meeting in Copenhagen, which I'm still thanking all the non-existent gods that I wasn't sent to. And for a country which more or less dominates the world of beer, the words brewery, piss and up come to mind in terms of the organisation, from what people have told me. If you could actually think of a worse way of going about it, that's probably, you'd be doing well. So if we're going to do it again, the IPCC, I don't think we'd do it that way. I think that this whole business of giving equal weight to small nations as to the major emitters in these conferences is foolish. And I think the whole thing just became a series of bandwagons about human rights and point scoring and agendas. And of course journalists get very, very sceptical about this, because they see the science being submerged in a great lava flow of politics and hand-wringing and point scoring. And the IPCC just becomes another political body, like a parliament or a senate or a political party almost, and that's where people start to become very suspicious.
So the science then becomes a side issue in many respects. So, I mean, Copenhagen, the science was very much a side issue, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, but it always will do. I mean, science will always lose out to politics when it comes to these big public policy issues, and there is no bigger one than climate change, because it is truly global. So, and in that sense, science will lose out, and it has to lose out. I mean, you cannot rule the world by scientists. Science should not rule the world, not at least not in my view. They lost out in Kyoto as well, 12, 13 years ago. Science lost out in the politics. So, I mean, the agreed commitments that nations undertook 13 years ago, 5% from the Annex I countries, was way, way short of what scientists then were suggesting was necessary. So actually science will lose out. In the end, politics has to take charge, if you like. Scientific evidence is clearly part of the evidence base that politicians have to work with, but it is not the Trump suit, in my view.
I just think we might be doing this crossing the line business, that what this is all about is defining what is science and what can scientists actually deliver, which is advice and maybe recommendations, but certainly an evaluation of what the situation actually is, and what would it mean if you did this, or what would it mean if you did that. After that, it's not really science any longer, is it? And maybe we're asking too much.
The David Nutt case again.
Exactly. And maybe we're asking too much to think that science can then have a huge influence beyond just saying, look, this is how it is. And it's the job of politicians to decide how much they can do about how it is.
And this brings back in many ways to the idea of risk and the levels of risk within that. Now, I mean, I'm going to move slightly away from climate change onto swine flu now. Now, when journalists are told that potentially the risk factor is 60,000 people dying of swine flu, or a handful of people dying of swine flu, which was what journalists were told, the journalists are not going to say, you know, actually, a handful of people could die of swine flu. The headline is always going to be 60,000 people could die of swine flu.
Not always. No. I mean, it can equally be a headline that the whole thing has been blown out of proportion and the swine flu doesn't really happen, and only 4 people are going to die. I mean, you have a tendency towards the extremes. It isn't just the worst case scenario. Often it's what on earth is this swine flu scare all about? That can be a story in itself. And it's interesting that has started to come out now, and Liam Donaldson is looking like a bit of a chump, because this isn't the first time he's said something like this. Yeah. And it's clear that you have a sort of legalistic position taken by authorities in public health that prepare the public for a worst case scenario, and you do have the cry wolf problem. And there are going to be elements in the media who will say, well, actually, you know, there was no such thing as swine flu, really. It was just a mild infection which went around and killed a couple of hundred people, and we don't really need to worry about it. So that becomes a story too. So it isn't just the journalists pouncing on millions dead.
And I mean, the problem is just as much for scientists as it is for journalists to know how to report that. How do scientists actually convey and communicate deep uncertainty if the risk is between 10 people dying and 60,000 dying? It's the same problem the Met Office got themselves into last summer with their summer forecast and all the forecast actually, all the science behind the forecast says is it divides summer temperatures into 3 bands, either roughly average, somewhat above the average, warmer, or somewhat colder than the average. There are just 3 categories. And the science attaches a probability to those. And actually the probabilities for that forecast last summer were something like the probability of a warm summer is, say, 45%. The probability of an average summer is 30%. The probability of a colder summer is 25%.
Where did the word barbecue come from?
Exactly. The word barbecue, of course, came from the Met Office public relations.
Oh, my God.
Director. I guess as an idea, well, this is a smart way to communicate.
It'll get some interest.
It'll get some interest,
Yes.
and it certainly got some interest. And of course, what it did, it put the Met Office on the back foot because the summer was not perceived by most people to be a barbecue summer. Actually, it was pretty much average. But certainly at the peak of the holiday season, we had 3 weeks of pretty lousy weather. So it is a problem for scientists or for science communicators to find the language or the metaphors or the imagery to communicate what is highly uncertain coming out of scientific activity.
Without creating a real nightmare for the future.
Yeah.
Because that is a real challenge for you, isn't it, Beth? The whole idea of...
Well, I mean, I was going to say, but I always feel a little unpopular saying this, that the risk in my previous job used to be a real issue for me because I used to work in the nuclear industry and communications. And there's a whole, you could write a Bible, I think, about trying to explain risks and trying to defend risks against, I'm just going to betray my paranoia here, but I always used to feel I was trying to explain a very small risk in opposition to an NGO person, for example, who could say, but it's unsafe, full stop. And in a way, I suppose that's true, because you could say a tiny, tiny, tiny risk means it's unsafe. And I could never say it's totally safe, because that would be a lie in scientific terms. And for me, that always felt like being on the back foot. And sorry, I'll just carry on in my paranoia theme for a minute, if you don't mind. And the upshot of some of that is that people make, I believe, really crazy decisions. So because nuclear somehow carries this terrible risk aura around it. So just as an example, I used to be responsible for communications for a site called Dounreay, which is on the north coast of Scotland. And it is a very old site. It has, I wouldn't say it didn't have terrible environmental problems from its history, basically. And in order to clean up some of the facilities left on that site, we had to emit very, very small quantities of a radioactive isotope into the Pentland Firth, essentially the stretch of water between the Atlantic and the North Sea. And we were required by the regulator, in order to meet people's concerns, you are getting my paranoia now, excuse me, to spend enormous quantities of money, like literally tens of millions of pounds, to avoid the risk of one death as a result of that happening. I love the London Underground. I love the extension of the Jubilee line, where you have glass doors that close against the edge of the platform so that people can't jump off and kill themselves. By spending a tiny fraction of these tens of millions of pounds, you could actually have glass doors on other stations on the existing Jubilee line. That would be a much better use of public money. But the perception of risk is all wrong, and I could say I've somehow failed, but I'm not alone in this, to communicate how tiny that risk really was. Sorry to go on about it, but for me it's a very kind of personal example, and every time I stand on the Jubilee line, I think about it. It's wrong.
I think we just have to accept the perception of risk is something humans aren't very good at. I mean, we're animals of a certain size that move at a certain speed and can see certain things and can't see others, and we can see trains coming but we can't see alpha particles, and we're slightly programmed to be more frightened of things we can't see than the things we can. I don't actually think you need to feel bad about the fact that you can't convey that risk effectively, because nobody could. I think we're just nuclear power. I mean, they dropped 2 bombs on Japan. They killed hundreds of thousands of people. Yes, the firebombs of Tokyo actually killed more people. But we can kind of deal with incendiary bombs because we can light a gas stove in our kitchens. However, we can't deal with atomic bombs because you can't make one at home. And the perception of risk is very, very different for things we don't really understand. And that's where you get things like GM foods, MMR. We don't quite understand squirting blobs of attenuated viruses into very young children. Lots of people get very unhappy about that just on the grounds of injections into healthy people seems to be slightly iffy. And these aren't just scientific questions. I mean, these are very, very, very personal, social, human questions. And humans as scientific animals are very different to humans as emotional animals. And we all have an emotional response to climate change. And I thought very interesting in looking at the films from Copenhagen is yet so some people's response is to be very hard-headed and argue for cuts of certain amounts of carbon. Some people's response is to get on stilts and paint themselves with woad and yodel. These are very different responses to climate change. And
some go on hunger strike.
And some go on hunger strike, because that's going to save anybody. We're all different.
I'd quite like to open this up to the floor, if that was okay. Do we have any questions? If you could wait for, we have a microphone. If you could wait for a microphone to come to you. By the way, in the meantime, could we just have a show of hands from the audience? Who here is a journalist, journalistic background, scientific background? Very interesting. And who hasn't put their hand up? What background are you from?
I run the climate change charity campaign on climate change.
Right.
Did you dress in woad and go on a stilt?
No, I didn't. I did various other things.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Okay, hi. My name is Melissa Carson. I'm going to try and be succinct, but it's sort of a complex question that I don't really know how to say very clearly, but let me give it a go. You talked about the incentives in science to be contrary, and we talked a little bit about the incentives in journalism to capture the imagination, educate, inform, et cetera, et cetera. The question I have is if you might comment on whether journalism has a responsibility to evolve along with the public. We've talked about how there is so much science in journalism at the moment, and how people actually have an appetite for that and an ability to understand and digest science to a certain extent. And you just made, when we talked also about risk, I hope this helps clarify my question. You know, I totally agree. You know, we have these emotional responses, but as we are more informed, we become more logical in our response, or our ability to understand some of these complicated issues. So, in a nutshell, does journalism have a responsibility to evolve the way that it reports on scientific issues to a quote unquote maturing audience? Does that make sense?
Well, that presupposes that the audience is maturing.
Well, I guess, and could you comment on that?
I don't think it is. I mean, I think whether the average person who reads what I write or anybody else here might utter is more or less scientifically aware than they would have been, literate than they would have been 40 or 50 years ago, I don't know. I suspect probably yes, to an extent. But whether the maturity of the emotional response is any better, I don't know. Again, I think probably yes. And I think it's interesting, the nuclear question comes up. I think the response now of the Green movement to nuclear power is very different to what it was 20 years ago. It was almost a definition of being green 20 or 30 years ago to be anti-nuclear, and now it isn't. And an awful lot of high-profile environmental campaigners are now very pro-nuclear power. And that's a very interesting change, and a very interesting emotional change. Because, I mean, it's partly the lesser of two evils issue, and it's partly the realization that, you know, nuclear power over the 6 decades we've had it has killed maybe a few hundred people, nearly all of them as a result of the Chernobyl disaster. whereas the potential deaths that will result from climate change are 3 or 4 orders of magnitude higher than that. So I think it's very interesting there has been a shift, and if you now go around saying nuclear power is good, you don't get the same response that you would have done 20 or 30 years ago. But I'm not sure that's the same for other things.
I'm not sure I agree entirely with perhaps one of the premises in your question about evolving. I mean, you're asking whether journalism should evolve to trace the growing maturity of the audience, presumably also to trace what you presume to be the growing certainty or clarity that science offers. Because actually science, certainly in my area, again in climate change, tends not to. And actually, the more we know about the climate system, the more uncertain we are about it. The error bars or the uncertainty bars or the levels of judgment that experts impose on climate change are actually broader now than they were 30 years ago. And so actually the evolving story of climate change from a science perspective does not make it any easier for journalists to report uncertainty or for the public to grasp uncertainty. If anything, it's actually quite the opposite.
I think, because the gist of your question really was about, do journalists have a responsibility? And I suppose I'd say I don't think that's really fair to journalists. I think the responsibility lies more on our side of the house, actually, that we have to be able to explain what it is we're trying to say in a way that makes it easy and sensible for the journalist to make use of that. But I wouldn't expect a journalist to have to sign a kind of Hippocratic oath that they would always put social responsibility at the top of their agenda. Sorry, I keep sort of thinking, oh, Mike's going to comment on this, but I don't know. What would you say about that?
Well, no, I mean, whether you think we should or not, we won't.
And it's not your job description, is it, really?
No, I mean, journalism isn't the same. Working for a newspaper or a radio station or a TV channel isn't the same as even writing papers, comment papers in Nature or New Scientist in some ways. And although New Scientist is far more our side of the defence than the other. Should science journalists feel responsible? Yes, only in the same sense as any journalist should feel responsible to report what is new, true and interesting. And I think there are some journalists out there who don't want to do that, and that's fine by them. But I think the vast majority of us do. I think most of us are very keen to get it right, because science is intrinsically interesting and the stories are intrinsically real. You don't have to make them up. I mean, nobody made up ClimateGate, the email scandal from UEA. It just happened, and we just reported it. And those emails were real. I don't think there was a single report misquoting any of them. And it was a very interesting story. I don't think journalists had a responsibility to do anything other than report what had happened, to be honest.
Oh, yes, question.
Oh yeah, I'm Ben Webster. I'm the environment editor for the Times. And someone has said before about journalism that we generally tell the truth, and we usually tell nothing but the truth, but we hardly ever tell the whole truth. And I just want to ask a question to Mick, actually. Mike, sorry. Are you ever tempted, or do you think scientists are, to perhaps, as we do as journalists, sort of ignore or leave out or underplay certain factors because it doesn't quite fit the theory? I mean, I know that in science you do have to do this laborious process of going through all the contrary evidence, but is there a temptation to, because you want to make yourselves secure with your papers, get published indeed, get reported, to maybe not give things the significance that they deserve? I mean, that is an absolutely daily thing that happens in every newspaper, that temptation, I can tell you now.
You pose it as a temptation, as though there's sort of a clear divide between the good and the bad. I simply would respond by saying, yes, every single scientific experiment, every single scientific paper, every single research application to a funding body is making those sorts of judgments. You have to choose what are the theories you want to test, what are the hypotheses that you think are interesting or that you think will get funded. You have to decide which are the sorts of data that actually you think may provide evidence that will discriminate yes or no against the hypothesis that you're posing. I mean, those sort of judgments are innate to all scientific practice, and those judgments come out of the individuals who are making them. They're not somehow delivered from some sort of robotic machine that is telling scientists what to do. They are judgments that individual scientists will make. And the pressures that they are under, whether they are career pressures, institutional pressures from their employer, whether they're culturally conditioned filters that will tend one group of scientists to look in one direction and a different group of scientists in a different culture to look in a different direction. That's for me, that's the bread and butter of what science is. It's a very human practice. And so those judgments are what we make every day, every week, every year of our career. And I don't see it as a temptation, i.e., you know, that I'm deliberately being naughty today because I'm going to decide this. It comes out of the judgments, the equipment that I have as an individual working in a particular institution at a particular moment to make those judgments that I think are best.
Sorry, you misinterpreted my question. I wasn't talking about prioritising, which is what you're referring to. I was talking about deliberately perhaps ignoring certain things because they didn't fit. I mean, you know, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good hypothesis. Mm. That's what I was talking about. I mean, obviously, people have to choose what they look at.
Could I just chip in on that one? Because, I mean, I know this isn't going to be the ultimate answer to everything, but one of the real key things about something that's published in the scientific literature or an application that goes to a research council is that it's subject to peer review. So if you're very clever, you can get around that. But on the whole, you're at least presenting what you've done to other people in your field who can probably make some sort of judgment about whether you're fudging the issue or not. So not 100%, but I do think it's different probably from a journalist choosing what they're going to put in a story and what they're not. No one's kind of double checking what you're doing.
Mm. Of course, peer review is again a human creation, and all human creations are subject to flaws, manipulation, and deliberate contravention. It's no different whether you're in banking or in science. You know, that is a human practice, and that happens. And one of the allegations around the leaked emails was that people were engaged in deliberately trying to subvert that process of peer review. And that is a serious allegation. And that is why the University of East Anglia have set up an independent inquiry to figure out actually is there substance to that allegation, and I think that's right and proper. So I'm not quite sure. Your question then is, do we deliberately go out to suppress evidence because it doesn't fit my particular political ideology? I would want to offer an answer that says no. I would not want to do that because I would see that as subverting my own professional ethics. But I'm not naive enough to think that I'm not subject to pressures, subliminal, subconscious, indirect. That does mean that we do filter and we do select. And I think, again, we're back to something like climate change, which is a deeply embedded, you know, the science and the politics and the worldviews that actually surround the debate of climate change lend themselves to being put under those subliminal pressures. You know, some people instinctively will think, some scientists instinctively will think that this is actually the big one. Climate change, this is the issue beyond all issues, and I want to make sure that, you know, my career is contributing to the solutions. For other people, because of their different cultural or ideological or political or religious perspectives instinctively think, actually, no, the risks are actually not as great as that. And so those factors do come into play. There's no, I don't think you can escape from that. But professional ethics, norms and practices like peer review, are there within science to provide checks and balances. And that over the period of time is what actually makes science strong as a form of inquiry. If those checks and balances are working properly, then over a period of time, science will self-correct. But it can only self-correct if those norms and practices are working properly and effectively. And that is why the allegations based on the crew emails are serious allegations, because actually they do suggest that those norms and balances, checks and balances, may have been deliberately being subverted by certain people.
We had another question there. Sorry. Yeah.
It's all been very cosy and lovely, and it's very nice. But PR got a mention, and we didn't really delve into that very much. And we often get headlines such as, you know, coffee is bad for you, butter is bad for you, this is bad for you, this is good for you, you should do this, you should do that. You know, we're often being told things that we should be doing, and these sometimes are surveys that have been maybe funding provided by a brand or by a big organisation, and this is supposedly scientific. And so those big headlines, they're great for selling papers, but are they good science? And, you know, who's believing it, who isn't, and how do we make judgments?
This is a bugbear of mine, and particularly the coffee one is interesting. If you go back to the late 90s, there's been about 120, as far as I can tell, peer-reviewed studies that have been reported in the media about coffee, of which about 63 say it's good for you, and the other 57 say it's bad for you. And is this bad science? No, it's actually terrible PR. What happens is you get very eager bunnies working as PR officers in these universities, often in the States, not always, sometimes in Britain, who will take a tiny study, often involving 15 or 20 people in the control group, and they will flag it up and put a press release out, and it involves coffee, which we all drink, and it will get an unholy amount of coverage. All I can say is that when you read these stories, look at how many people were looked at. If it's anything less than about 1,000, just disregard it. If there's anybody talking about a new funny equation for anything, like, you know, the right equation for making toast or something, disregard that. That's a fourth-rate scientist trying to get his name in the papers, with the willing connivance of a particularly dim press officer at their university. And, you know, big studies out in the end. In the end, proper science that's done by proper people involving lots of data tends to kind of survive. These rather daft stories that cause a lot of confusion, and less daft ones. I mean, another interesting one is HRT, hormone replacement treatment or therapy for women. There was actually some sort of inquiry, I think, in Congress in America on the reporting of this and how it was studied and why there were so many contradictory findings. And I can't remember what the result was, but it was just, it's a mess. And the problem is that universities want to get funding, they want to get noticed, and often very, very marginal studies will be given far more prominence than they deserve. I mean, it took about 20 years for the Dole study into smoking and lung cancer to really be accepted and given the prominence it needed. These days, somebody would look at 3 mice, find that one of them got lung cancer as a result of being in a room with someone smoking a cigarette, and we'd have your answer on the front page of the newspapers. But I think the danger now is that we look at tiny studies and attach far too much significance to them.
But as a journalist, I mean, it's nice to blame the PRs, but as a journalist, you know, you are accepting those stories and putting them in the newspaper, yes, or there's an editorial decision being made.
Yes, we are. So we are, partly because everyone else will. We can't go out and do the studies ourselves. You know, I had this debate with Ben Goldacre once, and I said, what would you have us do? And he said, well, not report it until we're certain, and that's a very dangerous road to go down. All we can do is report it with a certain degree of tongue-in-cheek, and make very clear that the sample sizes are rather small, and the significance of the results is rather small. But that isn't true of all these stories.
It does contribute, though, to this amplification of risk across society. I mean, there are examples within climate change of where this has happened, and it's not just in press officers and universities that are responsible for this. It's actually very sophisticated press people within government. And the example I've got here with climate change was in 2005, what, 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, in the run-up to I'm not sure which of the COPs it was, but in the end of November there was a paper that was placed in the journal Nature that suggested that the North Atlantic Gulf Stream was slowing down by up to 30%. It was funded by DEFRA, and DEFRA wanted a really good, powerful, new bit of science just before the negotiations. And here was this great piece of research that suggested that the Gulf Stream was slowing down by up to 30%. And it was shoehorned into Nature. The University of Southampton press office was certainly very keen about that, but DEFRA were more than happy to see it there. And of course what that study did, 12 or 18 months later, it was then reported, and it didn't get the front page of the newspapers, was that actually this 30% slowdown in the Gulf Stream has been rather over-interpreted, that actually natural variability of the Gulf Stream is up to plus or minus 30%. So actually this study in 2005 didn't really tell us anything at all. So there are various reasons why these one-off studies get into the media and how they amplify risk, sometimes for particular political purposes.
And it wasn't DEFRA, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I thought it was interesting that you said it was funded by DEFRA, because I thought there was an interesting edge to your question about branding and research funded by, for example, pharmaceutical companies. And I do think that somehow or another that has to be taken with a kind of fudge factor for who's sponsored this research. And it's one of the reasons why it's lovely when there's Research Council funding for research, because on the whole that is all done because it's good science, not necessarily because it's going to prove that your product is wonderful. And I suppose one thing that worries me a little bit is as we go into an era where there's almost certainly, although touch wood it might not happen, be less government money to support research. Are we going to end up with a situation where scientists who want to do some work become more dependent on companies funding them? So there's just a little question there in my mind about are we going to go into an era in the next few years where more work is funded by commercial interests than by the public sector? And maybe the fact that you think DEFRA was a bit prejudiced undermines this anyway. But for me, that would cause me a little bit more concern about what are you allowed to publish once you've actually found the results.
I mean, are there, I mean, going back to the point about scientists putting their name to spurious studies to advertise Nescafe or various different... I mean, are there great armies of scientists willing to put their names to...
Yes. I mean, these things do get out. I mean, it's quite common in some countries for you to be presented with some research. Say, I've been at a press conference where we were told how good chocolate was for you, and then at the end in the small print it was told it will be sponsored by Mars, and it's that overt, it's that obvious, it's that wrong, and you know, in the end, a good journalist turn round and say, you know, the first word of their piece should be something like the crows are waiting outside to be stoned. Mars tells us that chocolate is good for us, and you can make a funny piece about the fact that a chocolate company has produced some research saying that eating chocolate will make you thin and healthy, and that in itself becomes a story, and that's when it can shoot itself in the foot.
But do these stories actually get out there?
They
though?
do,
I mean,
they do.
But I mean, there is a responsibility there, I think, on the part of the journalist to do some of the groundwork for their audience. I mean, it's too much to expect that your readers to actually look at the small print at who's funding the research. I think that is...
But I will defend British journalism
for
here.
I think we're very good at this.
Investigative
journalists, they should actually be looking at who's funding this.
Yes.
You know, were the normal protocols pursued in the research? Was it actually pucker?
I would defend British journalists. We tend to be very, very cynical, possibly too cynical sometimes. And I think, again, you know, I don't sound jingoistic, but if you look at how some other countries treat research, particularly done by state bodies in their countries and by big commercial organisations in some of our near neighbours and equal status countries. It's a completely different take. You will not read the same amount of cynicism and scepticism in the French media about French science as you do in the British media about British science.
Can I ask a point about science specialists and the generalist reporters? And I think the point that you made earlier on about politics and you wouldn't get a bunch of political reporters having this conversation. I'm not sure possibly you would. But I know, having worked in newsrooms for the last 15 years, that if you sat around a newsroom and said, right, what do you know about politics, you would not get anybody. You wouldn't get anybody that said, actually, I don't really know anything about politics. The same probably about sport and about current affairs. Business, you would probably get someone that says, actually, I'm not really up on business. Numbers and science is another one where you would get people saying, actually, I don't really know that much about science. Partly because most journalists have an arts background. Now, is that an issue, do you think? I mean, obviously, you as a specialist science editor, do you see that as an issue in the generalist population?
I think it's a rather good thing. I think I'd hate to be in a newsroom or a newspaper where everybody felt they could chip in with an opinion about what I wrote about. And it's much nicer, much easier to have a sort of baffled look on your editor's eye when you tell them something, and they say, well, yes, whatever, and put it in the paper. I mean, joking aside, I think it's a bit of an issue. I think the UK, although as I'm defending our country, I think we also have a sort of culture of scientific philistinism in this country. If you look at the way some elements of the media, like Private Eye, deal with science, which I think has been abysmal over the years, with their sort of campaign against MMR and GM foods and so on, the sort of willful arts graduate mafia approach to science, that it's all kind of evil and sort of men in white coats trying to turn us all into Frankenstein monsters. And that there is a willful ignorance about science. There's a willful ignorance about numeracy as well, which is more serious. And this kind of refusal to deal with figures greater than about 90 by a lot of people in this country with degrees is extraordinary. And you tell them, well, actually, it's a 1 in 1,000 chance, not a 1 in a million chance. They say, well, that's the same. They've got lots of zeros. And it is quite extraordinary. And you're right. I mean, people are proud to admit they don't know anything about science. You'd hard pressed to find a journalist proud to admit they didn't know anything about politics. Although I think maybe sport, you're seeing some people are proud to admit they know anything about sport. I don't know anything about sport.
Yeah.
Fewer.
Could I say I actually think it's a good thing that there are generalists writing about science, because who are they writing for? They're writing for an audience of generalists who are not steeped in science. And I tend to think that the journalist has to understand it in order to write it. If they've understood it and they've written it in a way that makes sense to them, I think it's going to make a lot more sense to the audience than somebody who thinks, oh, I understand all this science, I'll just explain it in perfect complexity. So I kind of think it's a good thing. Just on the kind of science versus arts debate, I share a bit of this, oh dear, it's terrible that people kind of enjoy not knowing about science and maths. And they'd be so embarrassed to say they hadn't read a novel or. But I was talking to someone recently who said something very simple that just completely threw me, and it made me think completely differently. And he said, remember the great C.P. Snow debate about the two cultures in the 1960s, I guess? Well, science is one. And you look around you at the world we live in, and what we just take absolutely for granted today, and what we read about in the media. And I think he's absolutely right. And I stopped worrying about the fact that the odd person sneers a bit about science and maths. And I think it doesn't matter, they can sneer. It's science that has really affected and benefited our lives.
I think technology as well. I'm not sure science as well.
But yeah, but it wouldn't be there. They're on a spectrum.
They are two quite different things, though. I think we try to gloss over the difference between technology and science. I think the way our lives have been changed is not the same as where our thinking has been changed. And I think the thinking that was around in the 50s is still there. I think maybe the technology has just come and become a consumer thing. the internet has sort of taken over our lives, and Twitter and all this stuff. But I mean, how many people? I have no idea how it really works. And whether science has won, I'm not so sure.
I think I certainly would want to challenge that. And actually, what Snow was arguing 50 years ago was not just science winning, but actually science delivering salvation to humanity. I mean, he foresaw 50 years ago that science and technology would roll out and bring utopia on Earth, and that the humanities were dead in the water. And actually, Snow's analysis from 1959 has proved hopelessly off track. Because in that 50 years, we have seen the rise of environmentalism. We have seen poverty, endemic poverty, in parts of the world that Snow thought science and technology would solve just by rolling it out. So I think that's a too gross simplification of what actually has transpired. And many of the environmental risks and challenges that we are grappling with, including climate change, is one where science and technology most definitely has not won. So actually science and technology remain as much part of the problem as they are part of the solution. So I would want to challenge you on that.
Broadly,
well, I would just ask you, I mean, you wouldn't want to be sitting around in a room. Are you sort of saying because science and technology has, if you like, caused climate change, that's the issue?
No, I'm not. All I'm wanting to do is just to temper this ideology that actually science and technology are triumphant in the world, and that actually all we need to do is to roll out more science and more technology, and we will actually deliver a paradise on the planet. Actually, the really endemic problems are not ones that science and technology will be able to solve. They can contribute, undoubtedly.
They can do a lot.
They can do a tremendous amount.
And I'm not trying to say, this is the world's salvation. I'm just saying we should stop being so worried
science and technology,
about...
as C.P. Snow's thought, and we can forget about the humanities, we can think about self-reflection, we can think about values and ethics, we can think about those matters, to me is Snow got it wrong 50 years ago, and people who say the same thing today are wrong today.
Humanities are nothing.
Yeah.
I think we have another couple of questions. I'll take the gentleman in the red cardigan here.
Sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Michael.
Mike, sorry. You were sort of saying that you thought it was good that that there's more people who would say they don't really know about science writing for the newspapers. And I was kind of wondering, do you read your own newspaper?
Oh yeah, okay, occasionally.
How often do you look at it and see an article and go, I wish someone had run that past me first?
Occasionally. I think that the issues that a lot of the articles that cause problems are opinion pieces. So, for example, if I have a colleague who writes about MMR, and she espouses a view I disagree with. However, she writes it with a great big warning symbol all over it, saying this is my opinion. And I think in a way that's fine. I think if you want to write something that is just opinion, you can almost say what you want, provided it's not sort of willfully offensive. The danger comes in news stories where things slip in. And I think generally, you know, in my paper and in others, I don't see that kind of willful misrepresentation of facts. And if things are wrong, they're just mistakes. I mean, like I can make a mistake, anyone can make a mistake. So in answer to your question, simply, no, because who am I to tell somebody what their opinion should be? And if they're a news reporter, generally speaking, they don't make willful mistakes, willful errors.
But wasn't one of the problems with the reporting of the MMR that an awful lot of what people thought was fact came from opinion pieces?
Yes.
And the opinion pieces won over against the scientific.
But I don't think they did. I think it's a myth that the opinion pieces have won, because I think now, the general consensus seems to be that the MMR scandal has blown over.
They certainly, for a good period of time, they had a big impact.
Yes, they did have an impact, but it was almost inevitable that they would. And, you know, in a way, I mean, you could almost broaden this out to something like climate change, and I think there's a lot of guff written about sort of people being guilty for causing the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you know, somebody was going to have an Industrial Revolution. It happened to be the countries that did it. Somebody was going to end up being the first lot to produce fossil fuels and burn them. And the idea now that these countries should feel guilty for having done this is just ludicrous, because I mean, if it hadn't been us, it would have been somebody else. And I think with MMR, somebody was going to come along and say vaccines are a problem. And it was going to be an issue, and then somebody was going to show that it wasn't a problem. I mean, they've done these huge studies and meta-studies showing that the MMR vaccine doesn't give people autism. And it's entirely predictable what happened, and it would have been actually quite surprising if Andrew Wakefield had had a paper published in The Lancet, the media had ignored it, and the whole thing hadn't happened. That would have been remarkable. I think the lady with the glasses was actually first, but
Hi, I was going to ask about climate change, whether we could just knock it off quickly in the afternoon. My understanding, which comes from never reading a scientific paper, is just from watching a lot of media, is that there's a large consensus of scientists, and then there isn't a large consensus among the general public. It's a sort of kind of like, well, it's sort of 50-50. Some people think it is, and some people think it isn't. What do sort of journalists, from your sort of experience in newsrooms, sort of generally, are they kind of generally convinced it is, but want to put opinion pieces in for all the sort of general public, or I mean, yeah, what do they? Or, I mean, they have important questions to ask. I don't really. It seems like there's this big difference between the group of scientists, like a sort of the IPCC.
Is this about whether climate change is happening?
Yeah.
And whether it's man-made?
Whether it's man-made.
Right.
So whether humans are causing the rise in temperature.
Right.
I think, and this is, I'm not going to betray any confidences here, but I think among people whose title is science correspondent or science editor in London, there has generally been perhaps a degree more scepticism about climate change over the last 15 years than you might have guessed looking at the newspapers. I think I used to be very sceptical. I'm less sceptical now. I think the reporting of climate change has tended to be driven by environment correspondents who I think all too often have seen themselves as campaigners rather than reporters. And I think part of the reason for this gap between public perception of climate change and the scientific consensus is that the way climate change has been reported has been rather hysterical. I think all too often we have seen weather events reported as climate change, and all too often the kind of people who are apt to doubt spot this. I mean, I remember the flooding in Boscastle in 2004 was attributed on the front pages of both The Guardian and The Independent to climate change. And this was ludicrous. I mean, no climatologist would ascribe a weather event on northern Exmoor, northern parts of northern Cornwall and that part of the country to climate change. I mean, climate is weather over time. And
wasn't the Daily Mail's like something like Britain freezes and they still reckon it's global warming?
Well, this is making. That was the Express, actually. And when you do that, the climate change advocates will say, well, now you're confusing weather with climate. And they can't really have it both ways. I mean, George Monbiot wrote in his blog yesterday that all these stupid people saying, well, just because it's very, very cold, and they're saying this makes us doubt climate change, they're confusing weather with climate. But he himself wrote several times during the 03 heat wave that this is climate change, and he can't really have it both ways. And I think people are wary of this kind of thing. And I think the problem with conveying climate change, and I've always said this, is that by and large it's a story that hasn't happened yet. The really big bad things that are going to happen with climate change are not things that have happened yet. You cannot put a picture of climate change on your front page. And news editors want to see climate change happening. So what they'll usually do is several images. They'll either use some parched mud in a lake somewhere, that's a common one, some dead fish in the Amazon. If there's some helpful drought going on somewhere, they can show a thin child or a treeless tree, a leafless tree. But it's actually very hard to pin climate change down to an event.
And of course the polar bear floating
the polar bear.
on
and of course,
ice, yeah.
What made me laugh hysterically funny was actually this idea that polar bears swimming in the sea was an illustration of climate change. I mean, the polar bear is actually Ursus maritimus. It's the maritime bear. They swim. That is what they're for. And there will always be a point where you have a polar bear on the edge of the ice next to the sea because they have to go into the sea to get their food. And showing a polar bear in the sea does not mean they're all about to die. They may be all about to die anyway, but that isn't an illustration of it. And people get wind of this, and that is, I think, why there is a certain degree of skepticism. And I think it's very hard to persuade people that there's this massive big thing going on that we can't really see. And it's messy. It's not like MMR, which is not messy.
Do you think there's also a degree to which people sort of feel so bad about it, like, oh, I can't do anything about it, so I'll just ignore it in a way?
Yes, I mean, there's this sort of denial turns into despair.
Yeah. Or the other way around, in
yes.
a way. If you just feel, oh, this is too much, I'm not going to worry about it.
And people know, you know, we're a small country, we produce 2% of the emissions, and if we all drove Toyota Priuses tomorrow, it would make the slightest bit of difference. So people think, well, why should I bother? And the trouble with climate change is it's all about kind of you doing less, and people don't like that message. It sounds like tax, and you know, there's so many emotional responses to climate change. That,
I think part of the problem is it does get collapsed almost into the way actually you introduce the question that, you know, do you believe in climate change? So that actually captures the issue. There are several different stages you've got to go through. Is the world warming? Do you think the world is warming? If it's warming, do you think it's primarily caused by human emissions? If it's primarily caused by human emissions, how large do you think the risks are of this continuing over the next 100 years? And if you think those risks are quite large, then actually what are the sort of policy interventions that you would advocate? Now, there are 4 actually quite discrete questions. The first 2 are rooted much more in scientific evidence and analysis. The latter 2, very much more in terms of risk perception and risk management in politics. But those 4 get collapsed into the simple question, do you believe in climate change? So I think, for me, this is why some of the results of polls are so volatile. It depends how the question is asked, and it depends how the recipient interprets the question. So I'd actually want to, and again, it comes out to my point about where these boundaries lie in science reporting. Is it reporting science, or is it actually reporting policy advocacy?
So, look at that.
As a sort of a mere medic, having had to sort of respond to the MMR crisis, swine flu, and climate change and health side of things, I wanted to try and combine 3 of the points you commented on. One was the responsibility issue, one was the generalist versus the science specialist issue, and sort of combine that towards risks for the future. So if you have more generalists, correspondents, reporting without a level of responsibility on science issues, do we not run the risk that we're going to have more MMRs and more sort of issues in a world where the media is actually very, very powerful, having had to respond to outbreaks because of MMR going down?
Yeah, we will get more MMRs. I mean, it's quite easy to think of where there might be some. I mean, I'm always waiting for somebody to publish a paper saying sonography kills babies. I mean, you know, people have hinted this kind of thing. I mean, I don't see that there's more generalists covering this. I mean, my paper has, since I've been there, has hired 3 more specialists to cover science and medicine. So I don't think that's a danger. Maybe more in America, where I believe science journalism has shrunk a lot in the last couple of years. But whether or not that's going to prevent more MMRs, I doubt very much. I mean, the driving force, don't forget, the driving force for the MMR scandal was actually the publication of a paper in a journal which frankly should have known better. And a journal edited by somebody who wants to be a tabloid newspaper reporter. So we can't simply blame the national media for the MMR scandal. If that paper hadn't been in the Lancet, it would never have taken off. And the Lancet's editor should have known better, to be honest. And we cannot go out and do clinical trials ourselves. You know, if you ask a medical correspondent, do you trust what's in the Lancet, they will say, you know, on the first iteration, yes, they will.
Sure, but if the study had been analysed subsequent to it being in the Lancet, maybe you shouldn't, it's not your role to analyse it, but if it had, some of those issues would have stopped.
But it has been. It takes years, though. It takes years, though. I mean, it takes years to find out that this particular doctor was seem to be using doctored data and all sorts of things. I mean, you can't just find that out in the week of publication. I mean, that takes a lot of digging.
This surely is where the question of daily news and science is quite an important question, isn't it? Because as we were talking then, you were talking about climate change, judging it over decades, whereas actually we're often talking about an hour, 2 hours for daily news, and that's a difficult thing to marry, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a tension there. The natural sort of rhythms and timescales that are evolved in news making and in scientific, critical scientific scrutiny and analysis, and allowing the process of peer review to play its way through, those timescales don't fit easily together. But I think actually one thing we haven't mentioned that sort of fits in between those, and I think which science, and again the crew email episode illustrates this. There is a new place actually where adjudications are being made, not within science and not within the media, but in the blogosphere, on the internet. And what we saw with the crew emails is that I actually only knew, I work at this institution, and my name appeared on some of those emails. I only knew that these emails had been stolen 72 hours after they had attempted to have been uploaded onto the realclimate.org site. In those 72 hours, there already were thousands, tens of thousands of interpretations of what those emails contained circulating around the internet. So even the pace that I was able to keep up with the story could not compete with actually what the internet is able to generate. And of course, in the weeks subsequent, we found what are the number of Google hits you get now? Something like 130 million, I think, if you put in ClimateGate. So there is a new presence in the public realm that is sitting somewhere between scientific practice and journalistic interpretation, which is, in a positive reading of it, is the democratization of knowledge. In a negative frame, it is the chaos of a million voices offering their own views on life, the universe, and everything. And science, certainly in areas of high public policy significance like climate change, I do not think that we quite know how to handle that.
I'm not sure anybody does. I don't know if science is particularly bad in that area, but it's a huge sea change, isn't it? And the one thing I would say is the word you used, which I thought was absolutely spot on, was chaos. And in a way, the danger is if one very strong but ill-informed voice emerges from the chaos, isn't it? It's not so much the kind of complete sea.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to get as many questions in that time as possible, so we could make them quite short and snappy and to the point. So, at the back.
My name's Andy Bodicum. I'm a freelance photojournalist. I'd like to go back to the question of images that came up earlier, and the challenge particularly in communicating climate change through images and avoiding the use of polar bears and parched riverbeds. Given that images of parched riverbeds and perhaps drought are images relating to an extreme weather event, and that one of the effects of climate change is supposed to be the increase in frequency and severity of those events, there's a challenge there obviously for photojournalists to try and avoid the stereotypical images. What would your suggestions be in terms of producing images that would be useful in the media and to science that can actually in some way communicate that frequency and not just the fact that it's an extreme weather event? What's the answer for a photojournalist like me?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure for photojournalists quite, but I mean, certainly one of the interesting things in the last few years in the UK and a number of other countries as well is the emergence of new cultural and artistic practices around the idea of climate change. Kate Farewell, perhaps, was one of the earliest onto the scene in trying to mobilise creative artists in print, music, drama and so on, to actually catalyse new creative forms of expression around the idea of climate change. And that itself is actually can be quite challenging for science, because you let some of these creative minds loose with the idea of climate change, and they might do something to it actually that's quite different from what a scientist would do with the idea. But it is quite a legitimate and important form of expression, it would seem to me. If this idea of climate change is really as important and as global and as deep-seated as we sometimes claim it to be, then actually it should touch. We're back to the humanities. That actually the humanities do have something to contribute, because they can touch people and they can communicate abstract and sometimes ambiguous ideas in a way that scientific practice and communication cannot communicate. So it's maybe not for photojournalists, but yeah, maybe for photojournalists.
And again, this probably doesn't help, but there's a great deal of work being done in illustrating data at the moment. An enormous amount of work is being done on that, which might help to explain the story far better.
And trying to make the data tell an obvious...
Yeah.
Sorry, trying to make the data tell a story sounds just like ClimateGate, and that's not what I mean. But trying to create a simple graph that shows what's happening. I mean, I'm probably just going to betray the fact I don't really know the difference myself between weather and climate here, but the thing that always impresses me is what look like very longer-term effects, like the retreat of glaciers. Now, is that something that you would say is actually just a 10-year fluctuation and it's all going to go away again? Or is that not something that's actually more on the time frame of climate change and therefore actually reflects a real genuine impact?
But it's ambiguous. You can show a retreating glacier, but is it natural or is it human-induced? It's not clear. I mean, one quick difference, the difference between weather and climate. Weather is what you can touch and feel. Climate exists in your head.
I'd like to move on, sorry.
So actually, we've talked a lot about the science of climate and resources, but I'm curious if there's a special new ethical role for journalism now that science is making discoveries about the mind and how we form beliefs and how men and women are maybe different in their minds and how we have potentially evolved altruistic characteristics. Is it especially important now that the ethics of journalism is taken into account because it could use science to influence people and therefore policy using science, is basically my question.
That's a very interesting question. What would happen, for example, if science was to prove unequivocally that men or women were more intelligent than men or women? And this hasn't happened, but say it were to happen, should we censor it? Should we discuss it sort of totally sort of without emotional input? What happens when science makes uncomfortable discoveries? I think that's very, very interesting, and I think, in a way, that's much more edgy than climate change, which is a political and social issue. When scientists do make uncomfortable discoveries, then you do get some very sort of uncomfortable reporting, and it's interesting how scientists respond to this and how the media responds to this. And you touched on things like science of the brain. Lots of discoveries about sort of mental illness and the heritability of mental illness, which might impact a lot of people. And how do you report this? It's very, very difficult and very, very sensitive. And I just think tread with caution, but certainly don't ignore it.
I'm Mark Brain. I used to be a journalist covering international affairs at a time when climate change and science, climate change wasn't really talked about at all, and science was something that was only done by, in fact, we didn't even have science correspondents in the World Service at the time. I'm now a psychotherapist, so dealing with issues of the mind and the understandings of how the brain works and emotions and so on. Just a point and a question. The point is, where I come from is, having read a great deal now about climate change and the science of, I personally have come to the conclusion that it's much, much, much worse than anybody is than the discourse at the moment is allowing most people to realise. There's a lot in the blogosphere. There's books by James Hansen, James Lovelock, and Mark Linus, and various people who are setting out the direction we're heading. My view is that by the end of this century we're going to be in catastrophic meltdown. And I wonder whether, put this to the panel, that just as Nicholas Stern said of the market economy in his report in 2007, that history would judge the the response to climate change to have been the greatest failure ever of the market economy. Whether when we look back in 20, 30 years, possibly less, we'll look back on how journalism engaged with the issue of climate change as the greatest catastrophe, the greatest failure of journalism, of the journalistic paradigm, the understanding of what is news. Increasingly it's the next hour, and what we need to be engaged with is the next 1,000 years, our grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren. My own sense is that journalism will be seen a bit like economics and politics and pretty much every way we organise our affairs as human beings, to have failed catastrophically at this time of transition when we might have made a difference.
I think an answer to that was, imagine a situation where astronomers discovered, incontrovertibly, without any doubt whatsoever, that an asteroid was heading towards the Earth that would hit it in 400 years' time and kill us all. No doubt, no controversy, no scientists saying this isn't going to happen. Everybody agreed. 400 years' time, how long would it be a front-page story? We'd all be dead, our children will all be dead, their children will all be dead, their children will all be dead. My guess is we'd have a big panic and then we'd forget about it. So how on earth can you expect people to get worried about things being warmer in about 100 years' time, any more than they have done already?
Sea level rise of several metres?
Nobody's saying that.
Jim Hanson.
No, I think the point is, I mean, you're entitled to reach that conclusion. Jim Hanson has reached it, and Jim Lovelock have reached it, but there are a lot of scientists who haven't reached it, and certainly the language of catastrophic meltdown is not contained within the pages of the IPCC. The point here again for me is about good journalism reporting good science, and actually then allowing the processes of deliberation, discourse, debate, arguments and politics to work their way through in terms of what do we actually then do about it. The problem that the BBC got themselves into 2 or 3 years ago, and they had to pull the idea of, was it called Planet Earth?
Yeah.
Matt Prescott's idea, was that actually the BBC, or the directors, whoever it was who pulled the plug on it, were actually saying the BBC is deliberately now advocating certain forms of policy intervention in response to climate change. It was not simply about communicating scientific evidence and analysis. It was actually about advocacy. And the problem with climate change is that you can look at Jim Hanson, you can look at Jim Lovelock. What they actually are advocating in terms of policies are very, very different. So you can have exactly the same scientific interpretation of evidence, but that in no way prescribes the sort of policy interventions. And so then is it appropriate for any journalist or any journalistic institution like the BBC to say we have to have a carbon tax of $100 per tonne? Because some people will say that is exactly the wrong way to tackle climate change. So here again I'm talking about these boundaries, these crossovers, these blurrings between what is scientific analysis and what is legitimate argumentation about policy intervention.
We have got to wrap it up.
Could I just say, and so I do feel I'm kind of casting myself as the naive optimist here, but I'll just say it anyway. If you actually think about how much coverage there is in the media, which is almost universally suggests, I mean not totally universally, but almost universally saying that this is an effect and things are happening and something must be done. I actually think if you think what might you have expected to have been the case 10 years ago, I'm amazed at how prevalent it is in all the media, really. So I would almost take exactly the opposite view of what you're saying. I think the media's done quite a good job on this. It's up to our governments to get their act together.
I'm going to take 2 more questions. Apologise to everybody that we haven't got to. One there and one there. And if we could take them both at the same time, if we could. Oh, is it? Yeah.
Yeah. My question is, when is it that journalism actually starts picking up an important scientific, scientific problem, if you will, and particularly with ocean plastics? If you look at on the internet the various information and the lack of coverage, for example, through print journalism of the problem and how that might impact, if you will, the fish stocks, et cetera. When is it that journalists kind of wake up and say, wow, this is a scoop, and let's look at the science and try to pick that up and amplify it or communicate it to the public?
Wasn't David Schuckman covering that?
Yes.
A long
we
time
mounted a campaign against it.
Yeah.
So immediately and quickly, I think, is the answer.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Immediately and with some force, I think. Is
I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was 6-7 months ago. David Shulman did a whole series of reports on it for the BBC, and I know that you covered it.
As well.
And
it's been everywhere.
Yeah. Yes.
On that point about print journalism and redundancies and cuts, what's the future now for scientific journalism with a newsroom with fewer people in it, perhaps? What's the future? And a blogosphere with more voices? And that's from both a medical, scientific perspective and from a journalistic perspective.
Well, I hope it's healthy. I am a little bit worried about the rise of amateur journalism. I think there's nothing wrong with people pretending to be journalists and writing things on the internet, but I think it's a shame if that is used as an excuse for cutting back on professional news gathering and editing. And I think people forget about the editing process as well, which is almost as important as the gathering. But I'm fairly optimistic in this country. We have a pretty healthy media. Our newspapers make a lot of money and are pretty free. So I think there's no immediate catastrophe like there has been talk of. As to the blogosphere, I think it's a nice hobby for some people, but good luck to them.
I'd just say I hope that we can preserve the scientific media as we have it now. I don't know what the answer is, though, about guaranteeing it in the longer term.
There's no guarantee.
I wouldn't be quite as dismissive as the blogosphere, perhaps as Michael is. I mean, there is a tremendous variety in terms of quality and content, but I know in climate change there are some very, very good blogs around. It requires you to be somewhat more discriminating. But certainly it provides a service that science or its normal channels of communication cannot provide, and actually I think can do things that journalists may struggle to provide as well. I mean, one of the best ones is Roger Pilkey's blog over at Colorado, and he's done a very good bit of drawing attention to some investigative journalism around the potential conflict of interest of the chair of the IPCC, Rajendra Pachauri, and that is running on that blog, and it's drawing out a whole series of very important issues here about, here is a very senior person running the IPCC, and there are potential conflicts of interest that are not being declared with his business interests, and that has come through a science blog.
Yeah. I'd just like to thank our panel, Professor Mike Hulme, Beth Taylor, and Michael Hanlon. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed to the audience. I apologise for having to wrap it up. I know we could have probably continued talking about this for the next 2 hours, but we do have to get away. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.